The Wailing Ward. The fading glow of the evening sun barely reached the broken windows of the old Harrisfield Hospital. Its desolate wings stood silent, hosting only memories of the past. In the heart of this forsaken place was a ward that even the most audacious of vandals dared not to face, the Wailing Ward. Rachel, with her camera and a backpack full of ghost hunting gear, stood at the threshold of this ward. Beside her was Officer Dan, arms folded, his skeptical gaze surveying the graffiti-scarred corridors. "This is just an old building, Rachel. Nothing more," he grumbled. Rachel, an avid urban explorer with a keen interest in the paranormal, was not deterred. "This is where the lost voices of Harrisfield whisper to the living," she said, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. Her research had led her here, to the heart of countless tales of unexplained cries and disembodied whispers. They stepped into the ward, their footsteps echoing off the walls, disturbing the oppressive silence. Rachel's handheld recorder was on, ready to capture electronic voice phenomena, known as EVPs, a staple of any ghost hunter's evidence kit. The air was heavy with a strange feeling, like walking into a room where an argument had just taken place. Officer Dan eyed the medical charts still clinging to the door of each room. "Wasted lives, wasted efforts," he sighed. Rachel's recorder crackled to life, a static whisper at first, growing into a chorus of faint, anguished cries. She stopped dead in her tracks, listening. Officer Dan shook his head. "It's just interference," he declared. But the confidence in his voice had started to wane. Room after room, they found remnants of lives past. A child's rag doll, a spectacles case, a wilted bouquet of flowers. The detritus of the forgotten. And then, as the daylight finally succumbed to the night outside, they found it, a door hidden behind a tattered curtain, sealed not by lock, but by the decay of time. Officer Dan's usual bravado faltered. "We shouldn't," he began, but Rachel was already prying the door open, her curiosity a force stronger than caution. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness. Rachel's flashlight sliced through the black, revealing a tableau of horror. Straps on a bed, oversized and ominous medical instruments, and faded stains that spoke more of brutality than healing. The recorder captured a new sound, a clear, pained wail, followed by a voice, "Let us be heard." Rachel gasped, but before she could speak, Officer Dan grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "We need to leave. Now." They stumbled from the room, the weight of 100 unseen eyes upon them. The corridor before them stretched, warped, the walls closing in like a crushing tide of despair. They ran, the wails growing to a crescendo until they burst out into the night, the silence of the world outside grasping them like a life preserver. Officer Dan, once a disbeliever, sat on the cold ground, his worldview shattered. "I heard them, Rachel. The dead. They spoke." Rachel looked at the recorder. The voices had been real, a cry from the beyond. She had come seeking ghosts, but found instead the echoes of past sins. The wails of the ward were not malevolent, but they carried the weight of unresolved tragedy. They were not seeking to frighten, but to be acknowledged, to be set free from the torment of being forgotten. The Wailing Ward lay silent once more, but for Rachel and Officer Dan, its cries would forever echo in their memories, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between life and death. As they walked away from the dark silhouette of Harrisfield Hospital, they knew the stories were more than just stories. The wails they'd heard were the laments of the lost, seeking someone to tell their story, to bring to light the darkness that had been hidden away in the Wailing Ward. And Rachel would tell their story, not to thrill seekers or horror lovers, but as a solemn remembrance of the souls who had suffered within those walls. With each step away from the ward, the burden of this knowledge grew heavier. But so did the determination to give voice to those who had been voiceless. In the end, Harrisfield Hospital's Wailing Ward stood as a monument not to fear, but to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the hope that even the darkest of histories can be brought into the light. The Surgeon's Shadow. In the heart of the crumbling Harrisfield Hospital lay the old operating theaters, where the air still held the tang of antiseptic and the shadows seemed to writhe with the memories of surgeries past. It was here that a group of med students, eager for a thrill, decided to explore one fateful night. Leading the pack was Jenna, her bright eyes shining with a mix of fear and excitement. Beside her was Alex, always the skeptic, and trailing behind were Sam and Mia, who clutched each other's hands for comfort. They entered the main theater, flashlights piercing the darkness, revealing rusted instruments and an operating table that was stained with the patina of age. Legend spoke of a surgeon who once worked in these theaters, a man of genius turned mad by his ambition. It was said his shadow still lingered, haunting the spot of his greatest triumphs and darkest deeds. The tone of the night was set by the eerie silence that greeted the students. Every surface was coated in dust. Every corner held a creeping dread. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting. As they ventured deeper, the silence was broken by a sound that stopped them in their tracks, the distinct sound of a scalpel clinking against a tray. Sam's voice quivered. "Did you guys hear that?" But there was no answer. His question was swallowed by the gloom. They soon found themselves inexplicably separated, the corridors becoming a labyrinth, twisting back on themselves in impossible ways. Jenna rounded a corner and gasped. Before her stood the ghostly figure of the surgeon, his eyes hollow pits of despair, his hands stained with spectral blood. Alex, alone, stumbled upon a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The scrawled handwriting inside revealed the surgeon's descent into madness, detailing procedures no moral doctor would dare perform. With each entry, the line between brilliance and insanity blurred until it vanished altogether. Leah found herself in an observation room, peering into the theater below where an apparition of a surgery was taking place. Her eyes were riveted in horror as the specter of the surgeon turned to her, offering a bloodied hand as if inviting her to join. Sam, meanwhile, was trapped in a waking nightmare. Hallucinations of ether and the chill of steel against his skin made him scream into the silence, but no one heard. In his mind, he was the patient, the surgeon's latest subject of a twisted experiment. The climax of the night came when Jenna, searching for her friends, found herself pushed onto the operating table by unseen hands. The lights flickered above her, casting long shadows as she struggled. The ghost of the surgeon loomed, his ethereal hands poised with a ghostly scalpel. She felt the cold touch against her skin, the pressure, but no pain. Her friends, drawn by her screams, found her just in time to see the surgeon's shadow flicker and vanish as the light steadied. Jenna's arm bore a superficial mark, a scar that had not been there before, a terrifying proof of the encounter. They gathered, hearts pounding, breaths coming in short gasps, and without a word, they knew they had to leave. The perversion of the surgeon's Hippocratic oath had been more than just stories. It was a palpable force, a darkness that dwelled in the very walls of the operating theaters. As they hurried out of the hospital, the cold grasp of the surgeon's madness seemed to claw at their backs, his god complex a specter that was all too real. They left behind the ghostly operations that could leave real scars, both mental and physical. The students never spoke of that night again, but the experience bonded them in silent understanding. The dangers of a god complex, the thin line between genius and insanity, had been made clear to them in the most terrifying way possible. Harris Field Hospital stood silent, its operating theaters empty once more, but the shadow of the surgeon was never really gone. It lingered, a warning to those who would follow in his footsteps without heed to the ethical oath that bound them to do no harm. The students went on to become doctors, each carrying the scar of that night in their own way. It was a reminder of the responsibility they bore, the lives in their hands, and the ever-present eyes of the past that watched over them, waiting to see if they would falter. In the world of medicine, the line between life and death is thin and often blurred. For one night, for 4 students, it had vanished completely, swallowed by the shadow of a surgeon who could not let go of his dominion over the flesh and soul, even in death. The Maternity Ward Haunting. The abandoned St. Mary's Maternity Ward stood as a hollow shell of its former self. Its empty halls were once filled with the cries of newborns and the bustling of nurses. Now, silence reigned, except for the nights when the inexplicable sound of infants crying echoed through the decay. Jane, whose heart was heavy with loss, found herself drawn to this place. Her own child, taken too soon, left her arms aching and her soul searching for answers. Word had spread among the locals of ghostly happenings within the ward's walls, and Jane wondered if she might find some connection to her child there. The air was thick with dust as Jane entered, and her footsteps echoed in the eerie stillness. The once cheerful wallpapers, now peeling and faded, seemed to watch her with mournful eyes. It was here in this forsaken place that mothers and children were supposed to have begun their journeys together. Now it was a tomb of broken dreams. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first cry pierced the quiet, a chilling wail that tugged at Jane's heartstrings. She followed the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing abandoned cribs and forgotten toys. Suddenly, Jane found herself in the delivery room, where the spectral scene of a childbirth unfolded before her eyes. Ghostly figures moved with urgency. A mother's scream rang out, but it was the midwife who drew Jane's attention. The apparition worked frantically, her expression twisted with a grief that mirrored Jane's own. The midwife turned to Jane, eyes full of sorrow, and spoke in a voice that was like a whisper carried on the wind. I failed them all. Her hands, translucent and trembling, reached out to Jane as if pleading for help. It was in that moment that Jane understood the depth of the ghost's despair. This spirit was bound to the ward by the weight of her guilt, reliving her failures over and over again, with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. Jane spoke, her voice steady though her heart was not. You can't undo the past, but you can find peace. Let me help you. Together, they moved through the ward, Jane bearing witness to the midwife's memories. Each room held a story, a ghostly echo of joy and sorrow intertwined. They saw the births that had gone well, full of joy and tears, but also the ones that ended in silence, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any cry. The night wore on, and the cries of the babies grew louder, as if they too were seeking release from their eternal lament. Jane's own grief welled up inside her, a tide of pain and love that threatened to engulf her. But it was this pain that connected her to the midwife, to the mothers who had walked these halls, to her own child who had slipped away too soon. As dawn approached, Jane and the midwife stood in the nursery, where the cries had become a cacophony of longing. Jane reached out, her hand passing through the midwife's spectral form, and spoke words of forgiveness. You did all you could. It's time to let go. Find peace in knowing that the love of a mother, like yours, never truly leaves. The cries began to diminish, fading into soft whimpers and then to silence. As the first light of morning filtered through the broken windows, the ghost of the midwife looked at Jane, a smile of gratitude and release spreading across her face. In that smile, Jane felt a lifeline thrown across the chasm of her grief. With the breaking of the dawn, the midwife's form dissipated, leaving behind a tranquility that permeated the once haunted ward. The maternity ward was silent now, not with the hush of absence but with the quiet of restful sleep. Jane walked out of the hospital as the sun rose, feeling a connection to her child stronger than ever. She had come looking for closure and had found a path to healing. The weight of her grief was still there, but it was lighter now, tempered by the understanding that the bond between a mother and her child is unbreakable, even by death. The haunting of St. Mary's maternity ward had ended, but for Jane, it was a new beginning. A beginning where the cries in the night were no longer just echoes of loss, but whispers of everlasting love and the promise that those who are loved are never truly gone. As she looked back one last time, she saw not a haunted ruin but a place of passage, where life and death danced in the delicate balance, and where every ending was laced with the hope of a new beginning. The maternity ward, with its joy and pain, had witnessed the most profound of human experiences. And now it rested, its story complete with Jane's final farewell. The Asylum Annex. Michael's interest in psychology had always been more than academic. With a grandmother who whispered of shadows and an uncle who disappeared into his own mind, Michael was driven by a personal quest to understand the human psyche. So when he learned of the abandoned annex to the Hillcrest Asylum, notorious for its inhumane treatment of patients, he knew he had to explore it. The annex was a stark, foreboding structure, its barred windows a stark reminder of the lives that had been trapped within. As Michael pushed open the heavy metal doors, a rush of stale air greeted him, thick with the residue of despair. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound bouncing off the cracked walls and peeling paint like the distant murmurs of those who once resided there. Rooms branched off from the corridor, each one a cell that held stories of torment. Michael felt a chill as he passed each doorway, the sensation of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. The most oppressive room was the padded cell. Its door creaked ominously as he opened it, the musty odor of decay wafting out. As Michael stepped inside to inspect the archaic restraints that lined the walls, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fought to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his chest. And then came the voices, whispers at first, growing into cries and wails, the lamentations of countless lost souls that had been confined in this very room. Michael spun around, his flashlight beam catching glimpses of fleeting figures, their faces twisted in anguish. Among the cacophony of voices, one rose above the rest, a calm, authoritative tone that sent shivers down Michael's spine. You wish to understand our pain? It asked, and with that question, Michael's ordeal began. Visions assaulted him, each more horrifying than the last. Patients writhing in straitjackets, subjected to cold water treatments, and electroshock therapy so brutal it seemed a punishment from a darker age. and in each scene, a figure loomed, a doctor whose presence was as cold and unforgiving as the treatments he administered. This, Michael realized, was Dr. Ellis, the ghostly presence that had dominated the annex for decades. Dr. Ellis's spirit was not merely content with making Michael an observer. The student felt the despair of the patients, their sense of betrayal and abandonment. The psychological terror was relentless, an inescapable nightmare that seemed to fracture his sanity. Hours passed, or was it days? Time had no meaning in the darkness of the cell. Finally, the visions ceased, leaving Michael huddled on the floor, his mind reeling from the bombardment of suffering he had experienced. But Michael's spirit, though battered, was not broken. He understood now that these torments would not end until the story of the annex was brought to light, until the silence was broken and the truth revealed. Mustering his strength, Michael called out to Dr. Ellis, acknowledging the pain caused by his cruel treatment. He spoke of change, of the compassionate approaches that now guided the care of the mentally ill. His words seemed to pierce the veil of time, reaching the tormented doctor's spirit. The door to the padded cell creaked open, allowing the faint light of dawn to seep in. Michael stumbled out, the weight of the annex's dark history heavy on his shoulders. He was free from the cell, but he carried with him an unspoken promise to give voice to those who had suffered there. The sun's rays cut through the gloom of the ward as Michael exited the building, the air around him feeling lighter, as if the annex itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Dr. Ellis's spirit, and those of his patients, seemed to recede, their unrest quieted by Michael's vow. Michael went on to tell their story, ensuring that the cruelty inflicted in the annex would not be forgotten. He campaigned for the preservation of the building as a monument to the past, a stark reminder of the consequences of humanity's abuse of power. As Michael's actions rippled through the community, bringing the annex's history to light, the oppressive atmosphere of the ward lifted. The building stood still, a relic of a bygone era, but the shadows that had once dwelled there had dissipated, giving way to a hope that such inhumanity would never be repeated. The annex's haunting had been a cry for recognition, a demand for acknowledgement from the forgotten, and Michael, in his quest for understanding, had answered that call. The psychological horrors that had once plagued the Asylum Annex were now etched into the annals of history, serving as a cautionary tale and a promise of progress. In the end, Michael learned that to understand the darkness in the human mind, one must also shine a light on it. The Asylum Annex. The Cursed Wing. The hospital had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century, its walls holding secrets and stories that were whispered about on stormy nights. But it was the East Wing, recently christened the Cursed Wing, that held the darkest tales. Linda, with her hard hat set firmly on her head and blueprints in hand, was the construction manager in charge of renovating this part of the old building. She was a practical woman, unfazed by the crew's superstitious murmurs about the hospital's sordid past. The hospital's renovations had been uneventful until they reached the East Wing. That's when strange things began to happen. It started subtly. Tools would go missing or be found in bizarre places. Linda chalked it up to the crew's absent-mindedness. But when the heavy machinery began to operate on its own, nearly causing accidents, Linda couldn't ignore the problem any longer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the skeletal frame of the new construction, one of Linda's most reliable workers, Joe, began to speak in a voice that was not his own. His eyes glazed over as he uttered sentences in what sounded like Latin, the words echoing through the empty halls. Linda had heard the rumors about the wing being built over an ancient burial ground, but she was a woman of facts and figures, not folklore. However, as more incidents occurred, lights flickering, walls bleeding with unexplainable moisture, and her team being terrorized by unseen forces, Linda could no longer deny that they were dealing with something beyond the scope of her blueprints. The crew was on edge, accidents were increasing, and work was far behind schedule. Linda felt the weight of the project, and possibly the wing's troubled spirits, bearing down on her. One night, when the construction site was bathed in the blue hue of the security lights, Linda stayed late to catch up on paperwork. The wind howled outside as if protesting the disturbance of the peace. That's when the poltergeist made itself known. It started with a gust of wind that burst through a window that wasn't there moments before, sending papers flying like leaves in a storm. Then, a cacophony of screams filled the air, each one distinct, as if the ghosts of the past were all crying out at once. Linda's heart raced, but she set her jaw and stood firm. Determined to protect her crew and see the project through, Linda decided it was time to confront whatever was haunting the wing. She enlisted the help of a local historian, uncovering the truth about the land upon which the hospital was built. It was indeed an ancient burial site, one that held the remains of a tribe that had once revered the ground as sacred. Armed with this knowledge, Linda sought to make peace. She addressed the unseen force directly, acknowledging the desecration that had taken place and expressing her intent to honor the land. The air around her grew still, the sense of malice retreating just enough to give her hope. But the poltergeist wasn't done yet. In a final stand, it gathered its strength, causing a violent tremor that shook the very foundations of the wing. Walls cracked, ceilings groaned, and the ground beneath them rumbled with fury. Linda's team, who had gathered outside, watched in horror as the wing seemed to contort under the force of the angry spirit. Linda herself was caught in the eye of the storm, debris falling around her as she tried to navigate her way out. With a loud crash, part of the roof caved in, creating a cloud of dust and rubble. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as if accepting defeat, the tremors ceased, and the poltergeist's presence dissipated. When the dust cleared, Linda was found unharmed, standing amidst the wreckage. She had faced the poltergeist head-on and survived. The East Wing was rebuilt, this time with respect to its history and the spirits that had claimed it as their own. Linda made sure of that. The construction was completed with ceremonies that paid homage to the land and its original inhabitants, and a plaque was placed in the wing explaining its significance. The strange occurrences ceased, and the hospital's East Wing finally opened, serving the community without incident. The workers talked about that night for years to come, about Linda's bravery and the ghostly forces that had nearly destroyed everything. Linda had learned that some things were beyond the realm of blueprints and budgets. She had gone from a skeptic to a believer, not in superstition, but in the power of history and respect. The cursed wing had tested her, and in the end, it was her strength and understanding that restored peace to the troubled grounds. The frozen time zone. Arthur had always disliked hospitals, with their sterile smell and the constant beeping of machines. But since his heart had started acting up, the old Victorian hospital on Maple Street had become his second home. It was during his most recent stay that he noticed something peculiar, a section of the fourth floor where time seemed to stand still. Nurse Helen was the one who tended to him there. She was a kind woman with a gentle voice that had a way of making Arthur's troubles seem far away. But as the days blurred into nights, Arthur realized that Nurse Helen never seemed to age, and no one else ever seemed to see her. He first became suspicious when he noticed that the clocks in his room would stop whenever Helen was present. He'd glance up at the ticking hands, only to find them frozen at 3:07, the exact time Helen walked in. Moreover, objects around his bed would move slightly on their own, as if rearranged by invisible hands. It was a confusing, eerie experience, and it began to prey on Arthur's mind. Was it his medication causing hallucinations? Or was there something unnatural about Nurse Helen in this part of the hospital? One night, as the storm outside raged against the windows, Arthur woke to find the room bathed in a strange, otherworldly glow. The clock was stopped, and there, by his bed, stood Helen, her face illuminated by the flicker of the fluorescent light. "Helen," Arthur croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "What's happening?" Helen looked at him with sad eyes that seemed to carry the weight of years untold. "It's this night," she said, her voice a haunting melody of pain and regret. "I can't move past it." That night, Nurse Helen told Arthur her story. She had been a nurse at the hospital during its early years when a devastating fire had swept through this very section, claiming the lives of many. Helen had died trying to save her patients, and for reasons she couldn't fathom. Her spirit had remained stuck in the loop of that tragic night. As she spoke, the room seemed to shift and change, flickering between the modern hospital room and the smoky, fire-ravaged ward of the past. Arthur, despite his fear, felt a deep sympathy for Helen, whose soul was trapped in an endless cycle of her worst moment. Determined to help, Arthur and Helen began to unravel the mystery of the time loop. They explored the abandoned parts of the hospital, seeking clues and encountering glimpses of the past. The hands of the clock ticked backward with each discovery, drawing them closer to the fateful hour of the fire. It was in the hospital's old records room, amidst dusty files and forgotten histories, that they found it, the key to breaking the loop. A missing piece of Helen's memory, the name of a patient she hadn't been able to save, a little girl named Emily whose spirit had also been lost in the temporal storm. Together, Arthur and Helen searched the hospital, following the echoes of the past until they found Emily. Her small ghostly form curled up in the ruins of what had been the children's ward. With Helen's guidance, Arthur comforted the child, telling her it was okay to move on, that the fire was over and she was safe. As Emily's spirit found peace, the hospital around them transformed. The ruined ward healed its scars, the smoke cleared, and the stopped clock started to tick again. The temporal loop that had held Helen in its grip for so long finally shattered. With a smile of eternal gratitude, Nurse Helen turned to Arthur. "Thank you," she whispered before she faded away, her form dispersing into a cloud of shimmering light that seemed to breathe life back into the hospital. In the morning, nurses found Arthur asleep, a serene smile on his face. The fourth floor was bustling with life. The clocks were ticking in unison, and there was no sign of the ghostly Helen. Arthur awoke feeling a sense of release, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The strange section of the hospital, once caught in a frozen moment, was now just another part of the bustling building. Arthur never saw Helen again, but he knew she was no longer bound to the night of the fire. She was free. And in helping her, Arthur found a new appreciation for the precious, unfrozen time he had left. The Infectious Phantoms. The warning signs were plastered all over the decrepit isolation ward. "Do not enter, biohazard." Dr. Alex Monroe, a seasoned CDC investigator, paid them no mind. He'd been in zones hot with Ebola, H1N1, and other deadly pathogens. Yet, this was different. A disease with no name, just a string of symptoms and rumors of its persistence after death. As Alex stepped through the airlock doors, the world seemed to still. He clicked on his voice recorder. "Dr. Alex Monroe, entering the isolation ward at 9:15 hours to investigate new reports related to the contagion of 2005. The ward was a time capsule of panic. Overturned chairs, medical equipment strewn about, and the eerie whiteboard still listing patient vitals that hadn't been updated in years. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptics and decay. That's when he saw them, the phantoms. They were patients, frozen in time, their ghostly forms flickering like old television static. One by one, they turned to stare at him, their eyes hollow, bodies marked with the lesions and sores characteristic of the contagion they'd suffered in life. Alex's heart hammered in his chest. He'd never believed in ghosts, but the evidence was overwhelming. He lifted his camera to document the phenomena, but the figures didn't appear in the digital display. Shaken, he resorted to his voice recorder, detailing everything he observed. As he moved deeper into the ward, a chill settled over him and his skin began to crawl. He glanced down, his breath catching in his throat as he saw lesions forming on his arms. The symptoms of the contagion were manifesting on him, but how? Panic seized him for a moment before the scientist in him pushed through the fear. "This has to be psychosomatic," he muttered, attempting to maintain a clinical detachment. But as the symptoms intensified, so did the presence of the apparitions. They began to reach out to him, their touches cold, each contact spreading the chilling sensation of the disease further across his skin. In the bowels of the ward, Alex found it, the old office where it all began. Papers scattered, research notes abandoned. It detailed the original cases, the unknown pathogen. But as he read further, the entries became frantic, speaking of something beyond science, something that suggested a supernatural origin to the contagion. The last entry read, "We were wrong. It's not a pathogen. It's a curse." With a mounting sense of urgency, Alex knew he needed to break this curse. His recorder caught every raspy breath as his condition seemed to mirror the terminal stages of the disease. The specters closed in, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. He needed to perform a spiritual cleansing, but he was a man of science. The very notion was antithetical to his training. Yet, there was no denying what he'd seen and felt. As his vision blurred, he stumbled upon a small, makeshift altar in a corner, a last attempt by someone to find peace. Grabbing the scattered sage, he lit it with a flicker of his lighter, the flame seeming far too bright in the dim room. The smoke curled into the air, and as he chanted words from the research notes, a plea for forgiveness and healing, the specters began to dissipate. With each wisp of smoke, the lesions on his skin faded, his breath eased, and the room grew warmer. The voices fell silent, and the airlock door swung open, the blockage that had trapped him inside inexplicably lifted. Dr. Alex Monroe walked out of the isolation ward at 9:47 hours, the symptoms gone, his equipment in hand. The voice recorder held a tale that blurred the lines between science and myth, between disease and curse. The infectious phantoms of the isolation ward were no more. Their torment ended by an act that science couldn't explain. Alex had gone in to confront a contagion, only to be faced with the unknown, and in the process, he not only freed the spirits bound to the ward but also liberated himself from the shackles of disbelief. The echoing screams. The hospital was an island of silence, bathed in the weak glow of emergency lights. Sam Rivera's footsteps were quiet against the linoleum, the night shift's hush a stark contrast to the daytime's cacophony. As a night guard, Sam was accustomed to the solitude, but there was an edge to the quiet that set his nerves on a knife's edge. It was just after midnight when the screams began, a distant, torturous wail that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Every night, without fail, the same pattern played out, and every morning, the screams would be gone, as if they were a figment of a collective nightmare. Determined to unravel the mystery, Sam set up recording equipment. The digital readouts on his devices danced with the ghostly audio imprints of the screams. With headphones cupped over his ears, he analyzed the waveforms, hunting for a clue, a pattern, anything. It was on the seventh night that Sam noticed it. The screams followed a sequence, a repetition that suggested intelligence. The realization sent a chill down his spine. What if the screams weren't just echoes, but communication? On the eighth night, the screams intensified. No longer just a distant cry, but a cacophony that seemed to be closing in. Objects began to rattle on the desks. Pictures trembled on the walls, and the very air felt charged with a palpable energy. Sam clutched at the recorder, heart pounding, as he followed the sound to its epicenter. It was in the oldest part of the hospital, where the walls were thick with the memories of 1,000 souls who had passed through. The screams resonated here, in a deserted patient room that was always locked, always avoided. Tonight, the door was ajar. Pushing it open, Sam peered inside. The room was barren, save for an ancient-looking machine at its center, its purpose long forgotten by modern medicine. But it was the walls that drew his attention, shimmering faintly in the darkness as if they were a thin veil rather than solid plaster. Sam approached, recorder in hand, and as the screams surged, the wall rippled. He reached out, fingers trembling, and where they met the surface, it yielded like water. Panic and fascination warred within him as the realization dawned. It wasn't just a wall, it was a portal. The screams were coming through it, from somewhere else. Sam withdrew, heart racing as the implications spun through his mind. Was this a doorway to another dimension, another reality? And if so, what lay on the other side? He reviewed his recordings, isolating the frequencies of the screams. If sound had opened the portal, perhaps sound could close it too. He needed a counter frequency, a sound that could match and nullify the screams. The night wore on, and the screams grew desperate, as if they knew Sam was on the brink of sealing the breach. He worked furiously, adjusting dials, testing tones, and then he found it, a frequency that hummed in opposition to the screams, a sound that felt like calm, like silence given voice. He played it aloud, the speaker's volume at its peak, and the effect was immediate. The screams wailed, twisted, and then diminished. The objects ceased their rattling, the trembling pictures stilled. The shimmering wall solidified, the rippling ceased, and the portal sealed shut with a sound like a thunderclap followed by a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Sam slumped against the wall, now just a wall, the recorder falling silent at his side. The screams were gone, the echo of their existence fading into the stuff of memory and nightmare. The hospital returned to its quiet vigil, guarding the health of those within. And Sam, he guarded the silence, the knowledge of what lay beyond, and the power of sound that could both rend and repair the fabric of reality. The echoing screams had been silenced, but their memory would echo in Sam's mind forever, a haunting reminder of the unseen dimensions that brush against our own, and the night when sound had been both the key and the lock. The Vanishing Patients. Detective Laura Benson stepped into the sterile corridors of St. Marguerite's Hospital, her keen eyes sweeping over the antiseptic environment. Something unnatural lingered in the air, a cold draft of mystery that could chill bones to the marrow. As a paranormal investigator, Laura had seen her share of inexplicable phenomena, but vanishing patients were a new kind of challenge. The hospital had been a beacon of health for over a century, but the recent disappearances had cast a long shadow over its legacy. Patients, seemingly recovering, had disappeared from their locked rooms, leaving behind no clue, no trace, no explanation. The cases had stacked up, unyielding to conventional methods of investigation, prompting the desperate call to Laura. Her first night was a quiet affair until the clock struck midnight. That's when the air turned thick, and a sensation of vertigo took hold. Laura found herself in a time slip. the walls of the hospital peeling back to reveal its sordid past. She saw nurses in dated uniforms, rushing through the halls, their faces etched with fear. The hospital, in those fleeting visions, wasn't a sanctuary but a prison. The next day, Laura scoured the hospital archives. There, amid yellowed papers and faded photographs, she discovered an old scandal, a series of unauthorized experiments conducted by a Dr. Hawthorne, whose brilliance was marred by a lack of ethics. The pattern in the vanishings began to emerge, each corresponding to the anniversary of the deaths of those who had perished under Hawthorne's care. Night after night, Laura braved the haunting time slips, gathering whispers from the past until the entity responsible revealed itself, a formless specter born from the collective suffering of Dr. Hawthorne's patients. It was bound to the hospital, seeking to reclaim the lives stolen by the doctor's cruel curiosity. The final confrontation awaited in the bowels of the hospital, in the abandoned wing where Hawthorne had played God. Here, the veil between past and present was at its thinnest, the entity at its strongest. Detective Laura Benson had to face the entity and the horrors of the past to put an end to the vanishings and free the trapped souls, including her own, before she too became a part of the hospital's dark legacy. The life support ghost. The hum of machinery filled the intensive care unit at St. Elmo's Hospital where Emily worked the graveyard shift. The young nurse had always felt a chill walking these halls after dark, a silent dance with the shadows cast by flickering fluorescent lights. On this particular night, a peculiar tension hung in the air, a whisper of something amiss. It started with a beep, a rhythmic, pulsating alert from a room where the heart monitor should have displayed a flat line. The patient, Jonathan, had been in a coma for months, his condition unchanging. But tonight, the machines attached to him flickered and buzzed as if charged with an unseen energy. Emily checked the power source, the plugs, the backup generators. Everything was in order, yet the machines operated independently as if possessed by an invisible force. It was then that she noticed it, a cold spot in the air, a lingering touch upon her shoulder, the sense that someone or something was present. Determined to understand the anomaly, Emily pored over Jonathan's medical files, searching for clues. In her search, she found a worn photograph slipped between the pages. Jonathan, smiling, a light of life in his eyes that was now absent from his hospital bed. The next few nights, Emily witnessed ghostly interactions, a pen rolling off a table, a curtain swaying without a draft, and the monitors rhythmically beeping out what she realized was Morse code. Translated, it spelled "help me." Security cameras caught these occurrences, capturing orbs of light and distorted figures that electronics seemed to react. Emily felt a kinship with Jonathan, and a responsibility too. She took to sitting by his bedside, speaking to him, telling him that she was listening. Through this vigil, she learned his story, his regrets, his wishes, and the love he still held for those he'd left behind. One night, as a storm raged outside, the life support machine surged with a power that rattled the very walls of the ICU. Emily sat, holding Jonathan's hand, a conduit between the living and the dead. She spoke of forgiveness, of release, and of peace. As dawn broke, the machines quieted, the lights steadied, and a final message blinked across the monitors: "Thank you." Jonathan's vital signs flatlined for the last time as his spirit found the solace it had been denied in life. The ICU returned to its state of silent vigil, the machines now beeping only for the living. But Emily knew that the veil between life and death was thinner than most believed, and that sometimes, just sometimes, it took only the willingness to listen to help a wandering spirit find its way home.